right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today, Adriana Gascoigne. How you doing?
Great. How are you, Kent?
Good. Thank you so much for doing this. So Adriana, among other things, founded Girls in Tech, which is a global nonprofit that's dedicated to empowering, educating, and mentoring women with at least 58 chapters around the world, which I know is true because scheduling this podcast had to happen between trips across the planet, as near as I can tell. She's the author of a book, Tech Boss Lady, How to Start Up, Disrupt, and Thrive as a Female Founder. Before that, held a series of technology executive roles. You're a busy person. So what brought you...
Never a dull moment.
Of all things, like with all the traveling and running a global organization, I think, right?
Yeah.
To write a book, like of all the things in the world that you didn't have time for.
Well, it was always one of those things that I wanted to check the box, right? And It was a dream of mine to share really what's in chapter 1, which is what it takes. And it's my personal story of the trials and tribulations of my immigrant mother coming to the U.S. and my dad and my mom being entrepreneurs, and what I learned from my grandma, my Mexican grandma, and my Japanese grandpa who came over to the U.S. in a cargo ship and ended up in Mexico. So the story of their struggles really molded me into the person I am today and had a lot to do with my vision to be an entrepreneur.
Right. And what were they fighting? It's funny, like you do end up kind of what you grow up with. Like I've a friend who's invested in a bunch of real estate. Like I would never think to buy a bunch of properties, but he did it because his parents just always had real estate.
Yeah.
It sounds like your parents were just always entrepreneurs, like not working for the man, but struggling to make something happen in the world.
They worked for the man.
Yeah.
They had to work for the man for some period of time, but realized that they could really own their destiny and have a flexible family life, work-life balance. And so they wanted to make that shift. And they started becoming very successful, you know, because what you put into it, you get out of it. And they worked hard. They worked really hard. But it was doing something that they loved, and they were their own bosses.
Right.
So having that, my parents around, having the ability to learn how to build a family business and have control over your destiny, that seemed amazing to me.
And what were they facing? I had two grandparents. One was worked for the phone company and was miserable. Like whenever that was, like in the 60s and 50s, phone company, miserable. The other grandfather had his own cigar store in Muscatine, Iowa. Entrepreneur. Man about town, you know, big man on the board of the bank. And he had just had the most lovely life. And I always just remember that. Like the guy who had his own business, it was a store, you know, was happy. And the guy who worked for the phone company was miserable. I think died like 2 minutes after he retired. So, I understand. Don't work for the phone company. Well, I guess the phone company got cool over time. But what were they facing at the time, being Mexican, Japanese? Like, what was their struggle to be an entrepreneur?
So I'll take my grandpa's story. The main struggle for him, he came to the United States hoping to get a visa to work in Los Angeles. And there was a Chinese Exclusion Act happening around 1932. And so he couldn't get a job. And so he said, hell no, I'm not going to go back on that cargo ship 2.5 weeks where he had like dysentery and all of these random things happened to him. And he's like, I'm not going back. Mm-hmm. So he said, I'm going to go south of the border. I'm going to see what happens and just try my luck in Mexico. Wow. And he didn't speak one word of Spanish, right?
Wow.
And he's Japanese, so very exotic to Mexicans who had never or rarely see an Asian person in the country, especially in the 1930s. And he just fended for himself. He worked at a pig farm. Wow. Then he started a little watch fixing company. And then he, at one point, had like a pancake house.
I love those guys.
Yeah.
They're just like, I'm going to figure it out.
You're going to figure it out. And, you know, he was very resourceful, which I think is very important for somebody who's immigrating to a new country and learned the language fast and ended up opening up a restaurant in Guadalajara, which is in central Mexico. And that's where he met my grandma. Wow. And he was 10 years older than my grandma. And later on, together, they opened up a candy factory.
That's incredible.
And I was raised with, Willy Wonka, essentially,
right.
Having access to candy at all times.
But probably the factory was probably like, not like the Willy Wonka factory.
Oh, definitely not.
Was there a chocolate river? Okay.
No Oompa Loompas.
I imagine it was pretty hot in a chocolate factory or a candy factory in Mexico.
It was really, really hot and quite tragic at times. I mean, the kids had to work. My grandma and grandpa had 12 kids. Mm-hmm. My mom was number 7 from the eldest. And they all had to work, and that was just normal. You go to school, you come back, and you work, and you help out the family. And my mom has a really big scar from where caramel fell on her leg, and she had to rip it off. And it was just, she still has a prominent scar. And one of my grandma's kids, when she was pregnant, she was born with issues because of the heat from the caramel and the factory, sure. And so didn't survive after one. So it's just, there's tragedy with the triumph that came from building such a phenomenal family business. So it wasn't all.
How did they come together? Like, how did those are two pretty different culturally, I would say.
It's very different. And they made it work. Primarily because they had started having babies before they got hitched. And, I've had I was close to both of them. They're both passed. But I had long conversations with my grandma, who was just very emotional, had a very high EQ, very loving, giving, donated a lot of time, and just beautiful heart. And she had a hard time with the Japanese culture. She had a hard time understanding why it was rigid and cold and why they were just so focused on business. And
right, I was going to say that the two most sort of different, I don't know, but they're pretty different cultures. Like, of all the different things in the world, like the big Mexican, big family, open-hearted, the Japanese super
parties, hugs, love, kissing touching, as much as possible.
Right, and then the Japanese very closed, one or two children, overachieving kind of thing.
Exactly. Like, it's so different. But I love both of those cultures so much, and I find myself both of the cultures resonating. The discipline and work ethic of my Japanese grandfather and family, and the heart and love and passion and like hot Latina-ness from my grandma. Yeah. We can't get away from that.
And not the first love story in the world where people from two different groups come together. Like,
correct.
It's starting with Romeo and Juliet and all on. They're like the Dave Chappelle joke. Have you ever seen Dave Chappelle? Like, I saw a thing where he looks at the front row, and this couple does not like this joke, and he sees the woman's Chinese and the guy's like Hispanic, and he says, "I don't know much about you, but I know your kid's going to be the hardest working kid in the country." And they got really offended.
Oh my God.
I thought that was a little racist, but
no,
kind of a compliment.
Well, there are hard working groups of people, immigrants that come to the country, and if you have those influences from your parents, you're gonna, hopefully take the baton.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So how do they make their way back? How do they get back out of Mexico? Or who gets out of Mexico? Like, how do you end up back here in the United States?
Oh, so, they stayed in Mexico with, they raised the 12 kids there, 6 boys, 6 girls. Mm-hmm. And the story gets crazier. My mom wanted to go to Asia to meet her Japanese relatives for the first time. And my dad was done with the Navy. He was there for 4 years in Okinawa. And he wanted to spend some time traveling before he came back to LA, which is where he was born and raised. And they randomly, serendipitously met in Bangkok at the Prince's Palace. And my mom was with like the stereotypical little tour group speaking Spanish with the little flags. Yep. And my dad, saw her long, beautiful black hair and went up to her with broken Spanish and said, "Buenos dias, señorita."
Wow.
And my mom's like, "Oh, who's this strange man? Why is he coming up to me like this?" And he's like, "I cannot leave Thailand without seeing you again. He's like, I won't leave Thailand. And then so he met my mom and her two friends at their hotel and took them out to dinner with his last like $20-$30 that he had in his wallet. He says the best money he's ever spent. Yeah. And he was really true to his word. He told my mom that he would have a letter for her and a package waiting for her in Mexico when she arrived. And it was there. Wow. And it was a custom-made dress, and it was a beautiful love letter. And he came to visit 3 months later in Mexico, and they were married, I believe, 6 months later.
Wow. What a great tale.
Yeah, I mean, they've been married for 46 years.
Right.
So, I mean, that's like, I love telling that story because it's so rare to have marriages that are so strong that were so randomly, such a random encounter.
Plus, the story involves an actual letter, which is like...
I know, snail mail.
I know, it's so amazing.
It's crazy.
It went to Mexico.
We had to write a letter.
Worked.
That's so nuts. Yeah.
So coming up, what were your parents doing when you were growing up? What was their entrepreneurial piece?
So my dad worked for Lexar United Technologies. Mm-hmm. So he had a few different companies in tech as a technical writer. Right. And then he eventually got a job with a Walt Disney Company.
Oh, cool.
So
it sounds cool. I don't know, maybe it's horrible. Who knows?
Well, it was horrible, but it was cool at the beginning. And for a kid... for your dad to be working at Disney and get to go to Disneyland all the time, at least the first couple of years, it was awesome. And he would write the technical manuals on how to build the rides.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he did that in Tokyo Disney and Paris Disney and Florida, like Epcot Center, and also Anaheim and a few other projects. And my mom worked for, when she came to the country, Olvera Street, which is like a Mexican celebratory street where they have like restaurants and shops and things like that. And then after that, she got a job working at Mexicana Airlines. Oh, wow. And she worked there for 15 years. And that's how she got exposed to the travel industry. And that was her business, she opened up travel agencies, Southern California.
Wow, that was like of a moment.
It was.
Like the travel agencies.
And she got out 3 months before like the first OTA came to fruition and was announced. She's like, wow, someone is protecting, someone's out there looking out for me. That's
so smart. And I still see too in the mission, like there'll be 1 or 2 travel agents left.
You're like, really?
And I wonder what they're doing.
Yeah.
Maybe they're just drug dealers. I don't know.
Probably.
Money transfer.
Check cashing, whatever. Yeah.
I hope they're doing well. So then when you go into business, how do you kind of choose the tech part of you kind of end up in the tech part of the world, right? Like when you start working. Yeah.
So not when I started working. So my background's randomly in sociology, organizational studies, so spin on statistics and economics. And I always knew that I wanted to work with people, but I didn't know how. And so I got into marketing. So I worked at consumer brand marketing agencies in LA for all my internships throughout college. Manning, Salvage and Lee, Moya Villanueva, so it was the founder of Univision, and JWT, Hill and Knowlton, and I loved it. It was a lot of work, but I really, really loved it. And so that was my first job occupation, and I think it was one client that I had working for the state of California, Governor Gray Davis. Mm-hmm. And I worked on 3 projects: Partnership for Responsible Parenting, Healthy Families, and the No Smoking campaigns. And that's sort of when I started thinking to myself, I'm like, I need to do something that gives back. I need to do something that helps groups of people live a better life.
Right.
I'm not sure what it is still, but I love these projects and I feel really fulfilled. And I had a lot of ownership in the projects. So a lot of the success of those marketing campaigns was due to my passion.
And when you end up working at like a tech company or somewhere that starts to shape you in terms of like, oh, I think I found a problem here with maybe men and women in tech, and maybe there's something to be done.
Yeah, so I worked in a variety of different companies in different places, like Miami, New York for a bit. Like I said, LA, I went back to LA. And then it's when I came back to San Francisco, and I say came back because I went to undergrad in Northern California, that I got a job working at a startup, and I loved it. I'm like, where have you been all my life, startup? I was enamored with the flat environment, like the fact that I could wear many different hats, the fact that I didn't really have a boss and I can just be as creative as I wanted to be. And we were building a product that was really, really groundbreaking for its time. So it was like a combination of YouTube and Netflix combined. Mm-hmm. And we did a lot of the first white label solutions for Hollywood studios. So with like Warner Brothers, Universal, Lionsgate, Comcast, their FearNet. And we built the platform where they could sell and rent their content. Right. And it was really hard working with Hollywood studios. That's all I have to say. But it was an amazing experience, and that's sort of what kept me grounded and stuck to that industry.
You got the two male-dominated industries. You got the Silicon Valley and then selling to Hollywood.
Yes.
Fantastic. What was
double whammy?
There was one company I know, I think it was in the book, where you got to 50 people and you were the only woman.
Yeah.
Like even in Silicon Valley, that's hard to do. Like that's like...
it was 30 people, and then it grew, and then I was between the 30 and 50. I ended up leaving, departing, and it was really just tragic, the things that would happen at the company, that I hate to say it, but I was used to it, right? And I sort of became accustomed to this sort of bro culture that it was like, well, if I want to be in a startup, I just have to suck it up. And I really, that's not who I am.
So did you at the time, so I just had Julian Guthrie on, who wrote a book called Alpha Girls.
Yeah.
And it's about these women like Sonia Perk. They come to Silicon Valley in the 80s and 90s, and they're the first women to really break into venture capital. They get a job at Menlo. One helps build Salesforce. But they had that attitude. Like they sort of they were getting harassed for what they're wearing, so they would just change what they were wearing. People would be saying vulgar jokes. They kind of they were sort of more brush it off versus me too, shame you, bring you down today. How did you come? Did you know at the time you were doing that, or did you kind of in retrospect go, oh, I was just getting used to something I shouldn't have gotten used to?
That's a good question. I mean, I realized that I was not being myself, and that's hard for me. Someone who really prides herself in being self-aware and authentic. And I was feeling very inauthentic just to excel in my career, and I cared so much about that I put all of that aside. And later on, when I worked at a social networking company, it got worse in a sense, because I had a more sort of senior position, and when I had to go speak to executives or talk to the board of directors, to be listened to, I would go into something I call man mode, and it's how I dressed and how I spoke and the words I used and the eye contact that I had with people and the lack of makeup, and I would wear pants instead of skirts. Right. The list goes on, but there was so much energy for me to create this change, to really deliver the message that women can be themselves and also thrive in tech. And it's a really, really cool industry. Yeah. We're making these innovations and, in some cases, life-changing products. And I didn't want it to be limiting for women. And I wanted to hold companies and executives accountable for supporting women in their careers and ensuring that they were productive and safe and had the resources they need to succeed.
Yeah, there's a part of, I have to figure this out somewhere in the podcast. There's a part of Silicon Valley that I haven't quite figured out, which is that really early on, like in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of really important women. I had Jay Adelson on, who was talking about how if you used to go get a URL, you'd call some company, whatever, the government, and it was some woman who kept it. There were a ton of women, and then something happened that they all kind of went away, and it became male dominated, and then they came back, and then the male dominated part's the part that you kind of came into, where it was 30, 40 people in a company and one woman, which seems insane. to me.
It was, and it was all about culture.
Yep. And so how does it start with Girls in Tech? Like what was the impetus for it?
Well, just that, I felt that it wasn't a comfortable, productive work environment. Things like sexual harassment. The first week I joined the company, this guy, I think he was an engineer, he sent me an email that was very detailed and explicit on like, when you walk by my desk every day, I just smell you and I just love what you're wearing, and like, when are we going out? And I'm like, who is this guy? I literally thought it was spam or like from a Nigerian prince or I don't know. Like,
also in terms of like testing things to see if they work, has it ever worked for him? Like, did that like method?
We never got that far.
Did he ever notice that like never ever worked?
No, it does seem crazy, but it was true.
Yeah.
And I sent that to my friend who was one of the executives, and he said, "Come to my office. Don't share this with anybody, and like, let's talk." And I'm not a litigious person. I've never, ever, ever thought about that, but I did want to clear the air and get an apology from him, which I did. Yeah. But it was like so strange to have to work with him, and things kept on happening. A few more things like that, like what are you wearing? Da da da. Discussions in like the water cooler room, and there was one situation where a guy threw a water bottle to my head because I was talking to a reporter online getting excited about the product. He's like, "You're talking too effing loud." And
it's probably not the best way to communicate that.
Oh, it was not. It was not, especially because it was a full water bottle.
Good Lord.
And, I just felt overall a little bit of alienation and isolation. And the CEO ended up putting me on the other side of the office. So he said, "Okay, this enough is enough, people. Like, Adriana, you'd like leave her alone." So his answer was to put me literally on the other wing of the office. Right. I had a fantastic office, actually bigger than his, with a great view of the Bay Bridge. Right. But it was away from the engineers and away from the designers and the product developers. So I have to interact with them.
Right.
Like, I can't just be isolated.
How do you think that is now for like a woman in the workplace? Do you think that's still happening in that way, or has it gone underground? Is it transformed into something else?
I think that it is slowly transforming into more positive work environments because employees are holding their employers and HR departments accountable. I also think that more and more men are becoming advocates and mentors and sponsors to women, which is really great. And the more we see that trend happening, the more respect we have for women in the tech workforce. So I definitely see that transition happening. And then that makes more women want to apply for those jobs, right? So it's,
And so how should that work? Because that's kind of interesting. I'm like a white guy with a podcast. What, if you're a white guy and you're not harassing anybody, you're not getting harassed, it's not that you don't think it's happening, it's happening, but it's not in your world. Like, you didn't get harassed today, you didn't harass anybody today, so you're not thinking about it. What is the right way to be an advocate without being annoying, without getting involved in something you shouldn't be involved in? Like, what's the appropriate way to go, I want to do the right thing here. What do I do?
Well, there are a lot of resources online. I think that companies are starting to incorporate policies and training programs, management and employee training programs in how to interact with your employees, ethics guidelines, how to be moral in the workplace type of thing, what you shouldn't do. There's also anonymous tickets that companies are actually issuing, which are basically, if somebody is bothering you, then you can issue a ticket online, sort of like Jira.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Nice.
But for HR.
For getting harassed.
Yeah, for getting harassed. And And that way, I mean, you can add your name or you don't have to, but a lot of people are afraid that, they'll be exposed and something will come back to bite them and hurt their careers or jobs. Right. And so sometimes, having that anonymity definitely helps them. And then the HR person would have to respond within like 48 hours to the issue that has occurred. But I do think that now more than ever, there are resources and even like free legal advice to women that are experiencing these types of things. I think the government, the state of California, provides this as well. Mm-hmm. And there's EDP. EDP is a initiative that the state of California has put together, and this is for free training, like lots of great free training that a lot of people don't know about.
Right.
So go out there and do the research because it exists.
Yeah, it seems like there's got to be a deeper. I've run companies that it needs to be more woven into what you're doing day to day, because the trainings are good, but they can be kind of like brief. They get mocked a little bit because sometimes they're so ridiculous. Like they're not very subtle in their examples of harassment. You're like, okay, yes, I wouldn't do that. Yeah. But it doesn't quite get the subtle things that happen that emerge on a day-to-day basis in an office.
Yeah.
So how does Girls attack this huge thing you've built? How does it start? Like, how do you decide that's your entrepreneurial vision of the thing you're going to build?
Yeah. So it did start when I was working at this company, and I was getting really frustrated, and I was taking literally printed out job descriptions to local career fairs like at Berkeley, Santa Clara, UC Davis, Stanford. And I said, please work for this awesome startup. We're onto something. We're building cool things. And they would come into the office. I'd get them through the door, and then they would do an about face because they said, this is like a bunch of dudes playing Nerf ball and darts. And they didn't like the environment. They didn't think it was a culture that they could thrive in. So they would leave, right? And they wouldn't stay for even the second round interview. So I said, I was talking to my friend, TJ, who is like my only friend at the company, basically, and really sweet, smart guy. And I said, I have this idea. I really don't think I'm the only woman out there that is experiencing these like negative things in the workplace, and I want to help. And I'm like, what if I create this networking organization and, just empower younger up-and-coming women in the startup world? And we have the support network, but we talk about issues. We talk about, education and skills that we can build, opportunities like to start companies, whatever it is that we were interested in. We could do it together, like linking arms, essentially. Yep. And I launched it. Actually, Jonathan Abrams was co-owner of Slide, that dance club from back in the day.
That you slid down to get into.
Exactly.
Was the gimmick, or one of the gimmicks, I guess. Right.
And which is sort of ironic. I met my husband at that same club. But that's another story.
That's great.
For another time.
You've got a lot of love stories. It's fantastic.
Yeah. I believe in romance.
That's good.
But yeah, so he let me use the club, and that's where we had our first launch event. And 200 women walked through those doors, and I was just
you're onto something,
dumbfounded. Yeah. I'm like, oh my God, where have you been? Yeah. So I there's so much energy with the conversations and how they were glowing and engaging, and I'm like, I have to do something with this.
And so now I'm sure there were trials and tribulations along the way, but now it's a big global organization. Do you travel to the different parts of your empire?
I do. It's been hard. Yeah. I love traveling, and I like to think I'm a citizen of the world, but it is challenging to recover from jet lag and be on planes all the time and be alert and present and present well when you're on the ground and tired.
Like, what differences do you see around the world? Like, in terms of, Japan's not the same as Singapore, it's not the same as London, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what do you see?
There are a lot of differences, and this is one of the reasons I love what I do so much, because I learn so much in every city I travel to and the people that I meet, experiences I have on the ground. I would say, in like Japan and Korea, they're still experiencing a lot of sexism. There's a lot of misogyny in the workforce, and it's really sad, but people don't think that an organization like Girls in Tech is really needed. So it's really an uphill battle for us to put our stake in the ground in places like that, very traditional societies. Places like India, it's really cool to see so many female computer scientists, so many graduates with computer science degrees, but it is in some cases not really culturally acceptable to become an entrepreneur. So our entrepreneurial training programs do really well there, because even though like their parents or society says, no, that's too much of a risk, they want to learn. And they're very shy and humble about their abilities and their talents. And so we try to bring that out in them, build their confidence, build their leadership skills, educate them on entrepreneurship and why it's awesome and how they can just leverage their technical skills to build something, an innovation that in some cases is like solving some major problems in their part of the world.
The startup culture differences are so interesting. I had Marcus Dantas was on, who runs Startup Mexico, and he was talking about how their culture in the startup world there is very like not sharing. Like here you share everything and you're like, I want you to be successful, and you. He's like, there they kept things very close, and they kind of didn't really want other people to be successful. I don't know if that's how it works or not, but very different than here.
I heard that too. I heard that and I'm part Mexican, as you know. So I went to a couple of events there and realized, they're like, but don't tell anyone. Like, I don't want to share.
Right.
We're like, it's so different in Silicon Valley. Like, you're going to find out eventually. Yeah. And even when you launch, like, people can easily like steal the idea and do something different. And that is just the nature of the game.
Right.
And then people think, well, because this is my IP, because this is what I created, I don't want anyone else to benefit from this idea that I had. Then they're really closed off. But then that's a problem. They can't hire people. They can't create awareness of the product. They can't, in some cases, get funding. Right. So you're just sort of like, well, you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot.
In some sense, it is a special place.
Yeah.
So you come to write a book, which is a great book. It's written in a really interesting style. Like you write it it's a very, like you're just talking to somebody. Like it's a very, okay, here's, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do. And here's, I really kind of enjoyed that. Like how'd you decide that? That was so cool.
So, my editor and I discussed what the tone was going to be. Yeah. And I'm not someone who follows rules. I'm not someone who takes a very sort of cookie cutter approach. And even though I wanted this to be sort of a helpful reference guide of sorts for first-time female founders, or any founder for that matter.
Because it's very practical. It's not just your story. It's that too. But it's also just very practical advice. Like, here's how it's going to work, and here's what you're going to do.
Exactly.
Like, it's useful.
Thank you. I wanted it to be funny and fun and lighthearted. And I really, really wanted to keep it real. Like, I wanted it to be very authentic. And I wanted that authenticity to resonate throughout the book. And one of my favorite authors is Tina Fey. Yeah. Or favorite people, and comedian and actress and whatever. Like she is such a force, and I think has been a great role model for me, and in many aspects of my life. And so I visualize the brand that she's created and all of the amazing projects that she has going on, including her book. And when I read her book, I was like, wow, that's sort of the essence of how I want to relay my personality through every story I tell. Even though chapter 1's my favorite chapter because it's all about my family and my upbringing, which is
such a great story.
Thank you. Yeah. And I wanted to help.
It's great.
That's what Girls in Tech is about, and that's what the book is about too.
I think there's a point in the book where you take your stress, you roll it up. It's a metaphor like a travel T-shirt.
Yeah. Compartmentalize it, put it away. We'll get back to you later.
I was like, that's fabulous. Aren't all T-shirts travel T-shirts though?
I don't know. I don't really wear T-shirts that much, but that's true.
I'm no expert. Do you? So, Girls in Tech, Tech Boss Lady. Like, do you get caught up in like naming wars? Or people like, oh, you shouldn't call it Girls in Tech. You should call it Women in Tech. You shouldn't call it Women in Tech. You should call it people in tech and
Homo sapiens in tech.
Spell people with a Y.
Homo erectus in tech.
Like no good deed goes unpunished. I know that. So
we do get that feedback, and even from some board members, and even for some people who've been with the organization for a while. I have a really relevant story which led me to create the name, which has been the brand for over 12 years, and we're not changing it. It's stuck, and it's really it excites the members of our network around the world. So a few people who are bugged by it is not going to impact the longevity of the brand we've created.
That Jillian Guthrie, I think, was talking about with Alpha Girls, that they use the term girlfriends. And her point, the reason she used the term was because she's like, that's who, when we would go away to support each other, it was the girlfriends going away.
Yeah.
And she's like, that's not a guy expression.
Yeah.
Guys don't go away with their boyfriends, but girls go away with their girlfriends. So she's like, screw you. That's what it's called.
And I love that.
Yeah.
Like, that is she has her reasonings.
Right.
I love that she just, grabbed bull by the horns and just went for it.
But she's like, it doesn't mean little girl as opposed to woman. It means people who go away together and, support each other, basically.
Yeah. And similar thing. I actually was, when I was working at this startup and launched Girls in Tech, there was only a few women in tech organizations.
Yeah.
And they were mostly for executive women, like wine and cheese award mixers. I'm like, I'm getting nothing out of this event. These amazing women are not accessible to me. I'm not learning much from their speeches. I'm not educating myself. I'm not able to network like I want to. So I wanted to create a safe place for networking, building a community, and growing in one's career for my generation at the time. So, but I didn't want to call it Women in Tech because girls is like so much more fun.
Right.
Like it's
you don't need to apologize for it. I was just asking. By the way.
No, but I like to provide the story behind it because people do ask about it.
It makes a ton of sense. And Lady Boss was the book by Tina Fey, right? No, what was her name? What was the name of her book? It's like Boss Lady. It was something very fun.
I read it a long time ago.
Shockingly, Tina Fey had a funny name for her book. Some of the things that you learn, like that you leave people with, are actually pretty, pretty practical, pretty sobering. Like
Bossy Pants.
Bossy Pants.
Yeah.
See, that's funnier than anything I could think of.
Yeah.
That's why she's Tina Fey. Some of the things you learned are pretty kind of practical. It's one of those things like when you're young and you listen to people's advice, you go, I don't know what that means, and then 10 years later, you're like, oh. I get why she said that. Some of your things were get an attorney like early and listen to her.
Or him. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't be too chummy with your staff. Like reference check people carefully. Like what are those things? Like what are you seeing there or like learning that people need to kind of figure out?
Well, with the attorney, you don't know what you don't know going into startup, especially if you're a first-time entrepreneur. And, in terms of managing a staff and bringing in even consultants, you have to have everything in writing. Mm-hmm. Everything in writing. And you have to do things like performance reviews and have that in writing. So that's one side of it. The other side is the attorneys can really, help create a little more structure and give you, templates essentially, give you advice on whether to have a contract or offer letter, give you advice on equity. I think for my case, I'm too trusting. Mm-hmm. And with that trust comes naivete. And I like to help people for a living. That's what I do. Right. And so I end up trying to be very nurturing and then forget about some of the important things like having documentation and contracts in place. And I think an attorney, especially a nonprofit attorney for Girls in Tech, has been very, very useful for us. They have helped us with everything from trademarking, creating the 501c3 to, the employee contracts and things like that. And it can also help prevent something from happening later on.
Right.
And as you know, you worked at a startup, so I think...
everyone's not on your side. Well, especially I guess what happens is you get success. You're kind of like, oh, we're just trying to get by. And then you get really successful. And what you realize when you're really successful, there's a bunch of people who have like angles. Like, I'm going to get you, whatever. They've got some trick that they know that they can do this and get money from you that you never even thought, A, that people would do because you're like, that's not cool. And B, you didn't even know the angle.
Yeah.
Whereas your lawyer does. They're like, oh, they're going to make sure you do this or they're going to sue you for that or claim that this happened or whatever. So
yeah, they take a very non-biased professional approach to the situation. So I learned a lot from that respect. And and then the other point that you were making,
you're not friends with all your staff, really. They're your staff, not your friends necessarily.
Yeah, definitely do not be friends with your staff. I mean, it's really hard. At a startup, it's like you become a family.
Yeah.
And then you get to know each other. You're in a small group. You're socializing. You go to happy hours, offsites, what have you. You get to learn about their loved ones.
Right.
It's really hard. But I learned that as employees can be good friends. They can be great friends. They can be best friends.
Yep.
But as the boss or the CEO or leader of the organization, it's very hard to be close friends with your staff because the expectation is that you will be flexible if, shit hits the fan.
Right.
And you really can't.
Yeah.
You got to get your work done. You're getting paid a salary. If you did something wrong, you have to be disciplined. Like, there's things that will be very, very awkward if you consider your employee your BFF, right?
Yeah. It's really weird in a growing company, too, because there's like 6 people and you're all buddies. This kind of happened with Mark Zuckerberg early. He had like friends who were just like the junior engineer.
Yeah.
But then he had a huge staff. Mm-hmm. But like some junior engineer could just walk into his office and like ask for something like 4 layers. I mean, they cleaned it up, but it's a strange dynamic. So what's next for Girls in Tech? Like, will you write another book, first of all?
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I haven't thought about that yet.
Is it pretty exciting having like a book out? Like, I've never written a book. Like, it seems pretty cool.
It's really, really exciting. I think it's still a little bit surreal.
Yeah.
Like, I'm still doing, media interviews and podcasts, and also.
Have you seen it in the airport yet?
I haven't seen it.
That'll happen. I'm sure that'll happen.
We'll see.
That'll be a big moment.
Fingers crossed. Yeah. No, it's really exciting to see that and to be able to share my story with the world. But for Girls in Tech, we really care about solving actionable problems. And right now, the number one issue for the companies we partner with is recruitment, diversifying their workforce, and so. We have just recently beta launched a recruitment platform.
Oh,
so thanks. Yeah, it's a pretty big undertaking. It's our first product, like SaaS product.
That's great.
And really to connect corporate partners with top-notch technical talent from our network. Beta launching in the U.S. only, and then opening up to the world in the fall. Mm-hmm. And we have some really cool product features in it, like my favorite, an aptitude test. So we have thousands of tests that we offer companies, and if they want to filter the applicants, the candidates, before they actually reach out to them, they can see what score they got on the specific test.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's, I think that's a great feature, and it helps them with like narrowing down their search a bit more. So.
And how are you feeling about the future of girls, not your organization, Girls in Tech, but Girls in Tech, like women in tech? Like, how are you feeling it's going after?
I really think things are getting better.
Yeah.
I have a very positive, optimistic outlook on how we're transitioning to a more fair and equitable society. And it's not just for women in the tech workforce or women as leaders within the tech workforce. It's for human rights and social justice for women around the world, and how technology and education of girls and women around the world, especially in underserved countries, especially in places where women are oppressed, it's really making a massive impact. And we have our finger on the pulse of how that is evolving, and Girls in Tech plans on playing a huge role in that. And that's why we work very closely with a lot of local governments.
I love that. I love when these things end so positively. So how do people get? Don't want anybody emailing you. Obviously, you've had problems. How do people get in touch with you or follow Girls in Tech, like what's the way to connect to it?
Yeah, girlsintech.org. You can sign up for our website and get updates there. Or Facebook. Every chapter around the world has a Facebook page, and so all the posts are put up there as well. And every chapter has its own website too. So if you look at girlsintech.org, you can look at where we exist around the world. But yeah, if people want to email me, that's totally fine. They can email me. Adriana at girlsintech.org. It's pretty easy.
Great.
And happy to entertain questions or invite you to our next event or have coffee.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for doing this.
No problem.
All right,
Thank you, Kent.
My guest has been Adriana Gascoigne, tech boss, lady author, Girls in Tech founder. Thanks so much.
Thank you.